The image is almost universally known: a dog in a harness, a bell ringing, saliva being measured in a tube connected to the dog's cheek. Pavlov's dogs have become shorthand in popular culture for automatic, mindless response to a trigger, for being manipulated without knowing it, for being less rational than we like to think. But the actual story of what Pavlov did, why he did it, and what it genuinely proved is far more interesting and far more rigorous than the popular caricature suggests. Ivan Pavlov was born in 1849 in a small Russian village, the son of a priest, and he trained as a physiologist, a scientist of the body's physical functions. His early career was devoted to the physiology of the heart and blood pressure, and his later, Nobel Prize-winning work focused on the digestive system. He was meticulous, demanding, and deeply committed to measurement. He was also, by temperament, deeply opposed to what he considered the woolly subjectivism of the psychology of his era, which relied on introspection and self-report to study the mind. Pavlov wanted objective data. He wanted to study mental processes, learning, memory, association, without ever asking a subject what they were thinking or feeling. The discovery of conditioned reflexes gave him a method for doing exactly that. In the late 1890s, Pavlov and his team noticed that the dogs used in digestive experiments began salivating not just when food was placed in their mouths, but in anticipation of food, in response to the sight of the feeding bowl, the footsteps of the lab assistant, or other environmental cues associated with feeding. Pavlov recognized this as a form of learning encoded in the nervous system, what he called a psychic secretion, and he redirected his entire laboratory toward its systematic investigation. The methodological care Pavlov brought to these experiments is often underappreciated. He constructed special soundproof chambers to control the experimental environment. He developed surgical techniques to create external salivary fistulas, small tubes that diverted saliva from the dog's cheek to a measuring vessel outside the body, allowing precise quantification of the response. Every drop of saliva could be counted. Every variable could be controlled. The experiments were designed with a rigor unusual even by modern standards. Pavlov systematically varied the conditioned stimulus: bells, metronomes, lights, tactile stimulation, electric shocks applied at low intensity. He varied the timing relationship between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, discovering that the conditioned stimulus needed to precede the unconditioned stimulus to produce effective conditioning, a relationship that established the principle of temporal contiguity. He investigated what happened when the conditioned stimulus was presented repeatedly without the unconditioned stimulus, observing that the conditioned response weakened over time in a process he called extinction. He documented the return of extinguished responses after a rest period, which he called spontaneous recovery. He also demonstrated stimulus generalization. A dog conditioned to salivate to a tone of a particular pitch would also salivate, somewhat less strongly, to similar tones, the response spreading along a gradient from the original conditioned stimulus. And he demonstrated discrimination. With training, dogs could learn to respond selectively to one stimulus and not another. These phenomena, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, discrimination, remain foundational concepts in learning theory to this day. What did Pavlov believe he had proved? He was explicit and ambitious. He believed he had identified objective, lawful regularities governing the operation of the cerebral cortex. He believed the conditioned reflex was the basic unit of all higher nervous activity, that all learning, memory, and even the complex associations of human thought could, in principle, be explained as patterns of conditioned and inhibited reflexes in the nervous system. He called his framework a science of higher nervous activity, and he was deliberately avoiding the language of psychology, which he distrusted, in favor of the language of physiology. This ambition was both Pavlov's greatest strength and his most significant limitation. The strength was methodological. By anchoring the study of learning in measurable physiological responses, he produced a body of experimental findings that have proven extraordinarily durable. The limitation was conceptual. In reducing all mental life to reflexes, he left no room for the complexity of cognition, meaning, and consciousness that later psychologists and neuroscientists would find essential to understanding behavior. What the dogs really proved, in the end, was not that all behavior is reflexive, but that learning can be studied objectively, that the nervous system encodes associations between events in measurable ways, and that the boundary between physiology and psychology is not as sharp as either discipline had assumed. Pavlov opened a door that behavioral and cognitive science have been walking through ever since. Subscribe to Psychology Theories Explained to explore more of the ideas that shaped the modern mind.